Turning now to Zimbabwe, where voting is underway in crucial elections. This is new video showing long lines of people waiting to cast their ballots. Zimbabwe's current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, is looking to stay in power. The opposition has warned of election tampering and voter suppression. This is the first election since the ousting of former leader Robert Mugabe. He voted earlier alongside his wife Grace. The 94-year-old ruled Zimbabwe for decades. Mnangagwa was a close ally for much of that period. However, Mugabe has said that he could not see himself voting for him. For more on this now, we want to bring in Dr. Chipo Dendere. She's a political scientist and is following the election in Zimbabwe. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. What is the latest on the election? Does it appear to be a clear frontrunner at this point?
Not at this point. In Harare, obviously, and major cities, it seems that there's a lot of support for Nelson Chamisa, the young, the 40-year-old opposition candidate from the Movement for Democratic Change. But the urban cities don't really give us a full picture of what's going on around the country. The majority of Zimbabweans live in rural areas. So until this evening, when all the votes have been tallied, we won't know for sure. We're also hearing reports of various issues where individuals can't find themselves on the voters' roll. In one constituency in the west of Harare, a candidate was missing from the ballot, so they've had to delay that election in that constituency. So we won't know until the evening, but what I can tell you is that there is a lot of excitement. What I'm hearing from people who were alive in 1980 at independence is that the atmosphere feels almost like 1980.
So how will this election change Zimbabwe, whether Mnangagwa remains in power or the opposition here, Nelson Chamisa, becomes the leader? What's the likely impact on Zimbabwe?
I think there's a lot that's hanging on this election. The international community, the United States, the UK, neighboring countries in Africa, everyone has been waiting for a post-Robert Mugabe era so that they can begin re-engaging with Zimbabwe. Young Zimbabweans are eager to get to work. Unemployment is very high. Zimbabwe is very educated, but most of the young graduates don't have jobs. As I was driving around the country and speaking to young voters, someone said to me, after standing in line for 3 hours, I said, "Aren't you frustrated? Aren't you tired?" They said, "No, because if I go home, there's no food." And this election is the difference between me eating and not eating. So young Zimbabweans are pinning a lot of hopes in this election that the election of Nelson Chamisa in particular would turn the economy around. Those in ZANU-PF feel that Emmerson Mnangagwa has the firm handle that's needed to re-engage international investors. So on both sides, you have people that are hoping that whoever wins the presidency will change the economy for the better. Zimbabwe uses the US dollar, but the US dollar is not available. You can't go to the ATM and get your money. There is no money in the country. There's a serious cash crisis right now.
So what about the accusations, the concerns from the opposition that there is voter suppression going on, that we may not be seeing fair and free elections?
What I've seen is that in terms of people being able to speak out in urban areas, people are able to speak out, but there's still this underlying fear. So people will tell you things and then, they'll smile and say, "I know we're free right now, but we don't know how free we will be after the election, especially if the ruling party wins." In rural areas, I've had reports of serious intimidation where voters have been told that there are cameras watching them, where some traditional leaders have been telling voters that if ZANU-PF doesn't win, we're going to have a repeat of 2008. But even with that, what I'm hearing from Zimbabweans is that they want a huge voter turnout because they believe that any kind of rigging will be mitigated by a huge voter turnout. The Electoral Commission, I think they've done a good job with the resources that they had, but they could have done better. There were some reforms, there were some asks from different political parties that they did not look into. So, for example, today there was a lot of confusion on the part of voters on where exactly am I supposed to vote. And at least the polling station where I was in the morning, we saw 20 people leaving without voting because they were truly, truly frustrated and they didn't know where to go. At one polling station, I spoke to a young man who stood in the wrong line for 3 hours because the instructions were just not clear. So there are some of those things. Again, you're coming out of a dictatorship, an authoritarian regime where the Electoral Commission works very, very closely with the ruling party. So I think the Electoral Commission is having some growing pains. Transitioning from being authoritarian to democracy is a bit difficult for them. So I think they did well in some areas, but there are some places where they could have done better to assure voters that this is a free and fair election and to give voter confidence. But even with that, I do want to emphasize that Zimbabweans are going out to vote in their numbers, even though they are aware that not all the reforms have been addressed. In particular, I don't know if I've already mentioned this, but our media is not free and fair. The state media has not given equal coverage to the opposition parties, so that's a big concern. But again, people are going out to vote. It's about 4 p.m. right now. The lines at the polling station where I am are still circling around 2 blocks of classrooms.
So, you mentioned decades of being under a dictatorship, so they're not as practiced as they could have been. This is the first time in decades that President Mugabe is not on the ballot. Is that having any sort of impact on the elections?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I think even Robert Mugabe himself said that he had some trepidation about participating in an election that is not a candidate. But I think what that's done is bring people a bit of excitement and relief, because Robert Mugabe was a very feared man. And not having him on the ballot has encouraged more people to turn out and vote. You see a lot of things that I've written and others have written that sort of focused on the first-time voters that are 18 and 23 years old. But over the last few weeks, I've actually discovered that quite a few of the first-time voters are adult voters, people born before 1980, people born in 1980 who just haven't participated in elections before because they didn't think they would be free and fair. They didn't think Robert Mugabe would ever leave office. And those people, those 38-year-olds, 40-year-olds, are participating for the first time in this election.
Why did Mugabe say that he wasn't sure if he could vote for Mnangagwa?
He said that he feels that he's been tormented over the last 8 months that he's been in office. He's frustrated with the way that the ruling party has spoken about his wife. They've gone from singing praises about Robert Mugabe and Grace Mugabe every day in the media to totally destroying them almost every day. And so he said that that's frustrated him. He's also upset that he hasn't received his pension that was promised to him. And he's just said that people can't visit him, and he feels that people are afraid to visit him, and there's a sense of being under house arrest. So those are some of the things that he mentioned, that the new government may not have been as transparent in how they've dealt with Robert Mugabe as they've told us. But again, Robert Mugabe is very manipulative, so it's quite difficult for voters to gauge what's true and what's not.
All right, the liabilities of being a retired dictator. Dr. Chipo Dendere in Zimbabwe, thank you so much, doctor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.